So we'll get into here, Genesis chapter 14 and 15. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. We're introduced to a character named Melchizedek. It's important for us to begin our conversation discussing Melchizedek because he's an indication that God has been working with people who are not Abraham. They are not specifically of Israel. And we knew that. Noah's not a child of Abraham. We knew he was walking with God. Enoch wasn't a child of Abraham. We knew he was walking with God. But we can be left with the impression that after the Tower of Babel, no one is walking with God. And I even said that. And Abram is called out of the Sumerian kingdom to begin a journey with God because the process of walking with God had been lost. And there is a sense in which Genesis presents it that way, but there are clues that we don't have the whole story. And we've been talking about this, Minister Joe, from Genesis 1, that this is a summarized history. It is highly edited, and God has organized it in such a way that this is the way we remember it. It's the right way for Christians to remember it. But it doesn't give us all the details. And Melchizedek is a little tease that God is working with other nations. We don't know to what extent. We don't know how Melchizedek came by the knowledge of the God Most High. We don't know how he became a priest. We don't know what the city of Salem was organized like. We don't know if God gave them any rules to follow or if they're just guessing. We know none of that information. But we do know that there is a priest of the same God who has revealed himself to Abraham living in the land of Canaan in the city of Salem, which eventually becomes Jerusalem. So that is important for Genesis 15 because God is going to talk to us, to Abraham, about the people of the land of Canaan and what he's doing with them.
Yeah. Whether we said it or not, I wanted to just make a comment about that as well. Abraham's opportunity to be blessed by Melchizedek affirms his original calling in chapter 13. 12 I'm referring to, sorry. Yeah. Chapter 12, where God says, I will bless you, and I'll bless those who bless you, yep, and curse those who curse you. And I think we probably said that in our last time together. But I just wanted to point out that this is a real time event that actually reflects that even more so, as Abram is giving his offering to Melchizedek.
Yeah, he blesses him. And you're absolutely right to point it out. It's a significant moment in the story of Abraham because up until this point, he's been blessed at the cost of others, mm-hmm, right? Egypt gets curses. Abram goes away with some bribe money to leave. Abimelech's family, which we haven't gotten to yet in the text, but we discussed it. There's curses there that fall on Abimelech's family, and Abraham benefits. But here, Abram gives to Melchizedek. He's purely a blessing. This is probably, maybe it's going to happen again, but no, it definitely happens with Sodom and Gomorrah because his prayers for those cities are blessings, no doubt. But this is one of the few rare occasions in the life of Abraham where he fulfills the promise God made to him that he would be a blessing to the nations. Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God, but he is a king of the nations. And Abraham blesses him. Now, of course, he blesses him because he recognizes they worship the same God. And why, you guys didn't get into this too much, but there's no law yet. How did Abraham know to give 10% when no law has been given yet? And was that just spontaneous, or was Abraham following a rule? Did the 10% law later, was it based on this activity of Abraham? Or was Abraham's activity sourced in a deeper law that God reveals at Sinai? Very difficult to say. But Abraham gives 10% of everything that he collects in this campaign to the city of Salem. And it seems the writer of Hebrews later will say it's because of who Melchizedek was that Abraham chose to do that. But it is, you're right, the first time he blesses a Gentile.
fulfilling that very promise.
Yeah. Interesting too that Abraham did not want to take any money from Sodom, and he seems to be aware of their wickedness. This has an interesting New Testament parallel, because Paul also refuses to receive income from the Corinthians. And he doesn't do that with other churches. He receives income from other churches, but he won't receive income from the Corinthians. It smacks me of Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm not saying that the Corinthians were evil, but they are a plagued congregation with a lot of problems. And Paul seems to discern that accepting monetary support from them there would be a cost to that he wasn't willing to pay. And Abraham too realizes that taking money from Sodom and Gomorrah is not in his best interest. So it's one little practical thing about that. I was once taught, I won't say who, but I was mentored by a minister who told me that you should always accept gifts from lay people, because some people, you need to give them the blessing of being a blessing. And I said to him, the Bible seems to me to say that you should be careful about that, because there are times in which the people in the scriptures refuse gifts and times in which they receive them. And this is an example I used, because he refuses a gift from Sodom. He refuses it. So anyway, all kinds of practical applications when you dig deep into the scriptures.
Yeah.
But of course, knowing which you're dealing with and knowing when God would have you receive and when he wouldn't you're going to need a relationship with the Lord to figure that out, right?
Yeah. Well, most of what they had, I think, was probably dirty money.
It seems clear enough that society was given to all kinds of misbehaviors.
Great sinners against the Lord.
Great sinners. They were great sinners. Yeah.
Good at it.
Yeah. So let's read this and then we'll get into it. So this is Genesis 15, verse 1. After these things, so this is after the war and all of that, and the interaction with Melchizedek and the refusal of the gift of Sodom. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You've given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So we'll stop there for now. Before we started this recording, Minister Joe, we talked a lot about praying and how to discern when it's God speaking to us and when it's not. There's something of that here, wouldn't you say? Something about Abraham wanting clarification, wanting some sort of certainty, because he was promised a child. And it's been a long time.
Yeah. Well, most definitely God uses a change of analogies from earlier this week. If people were paying attention to the sermon, the text that I preached on this week talked about all the dust would be the descendants of Abram.
Yeah.
But here he uses the stars, so I think maybe that's a bit more attractive than dust. But I think there is that struggle that Abram is seeing here. I mean, God says to him initially, "I am your shield. I am your protector. I am the one who's going to be defensive of you or defend you from any harm here." And yet Abram immediately jumps in and says, "What do you mean? I don't have any kids. Where's my kids?"
Do you get a sense this has been a burning question on Abraham's heart ever since God promised him he would be a great nation? Because that happened in chapter 12, and then it was reiterated in chapter 13, as you've mentioned. But he reveals that the heir of everything he has is one of the servants in his house, which tells us that slavery in this time is very different than the slavery that we experienced in the United States and in Europe. Because here, the slave, the right word is slave, but he can actually be an inheritor and become the master of all of this property if Abraham has no children. Mm-hmm. So right now, God has promised Abraham that he's going to have all these children, and yet he's in his 90s and he is childless. And right now, his heir is a servant in his house, a servant who loves him. We'll find out later.
Yeah.
And a servant that he loves like a son, but not his son. So this has been maybe gnawing at Abraham, and finally he's gotten up the courage to ask it, like, okay, you made these promises, but I don't have any kids.
Well, it's also clarifying too, because one could assume that Lot was a rightful heir.
Lot could have been an heir. Technically, he has already been the heir of his father's estate, which is Abraham's. But you're right. Yeah, but they've separated.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that separation was a little bit more than simply deciding to graze their flocks in other areas. Lot has left Abraham's household.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah, but also on the same token, whether their inheritance laws were the same as like ours, you could include just about anybody. But it's obvious to me that Abram is like, that we got something's happening here. We got to make some things change.
Yeah.
In order for that to happen, but he doesn't mention Lot. And I think that's significant because I think it's pretty obvious, or maybe foreshadowing a future, like you brought up Saul earlier. Some people say he had half a heart or half of God's heart.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the
what it indicates is that even when Abraham and Lot were living together, they were not together. Lot refused to be part of Abraham's household. He had maintained his own autonomy. Mm-hmm. And that's why they eventually split.
Yeah.
Now, Lot could have become part of Abraham's household and we would have been in a different situation. But he clearly did not do that. And so whatever the rules of inheriting were in these days, we have no access to those other than these stories. So what it seems then, based on the story, is that Abraham did not consider Lot a proper inheritor.
Right. Like he's disqualified. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think he's disqualified because he went to Sodom or something like that. My sense is that he never united. They were traveling together, but they never united.
Yeah.
Jacob and Esau would not be a legitimate heir to Jacob. I mean, the fact that they're brothers doesn't mean that they are inheritors.
Right.
You need to be a child or someone who lives under your authority. And Eliezer is the only one living under Abraham's authority. Yeah, so it's a strange situation that they're in, very different than our culture. But the question that Abraham asks of God is very legitimate, and I would dare say contemporary. Wouldn't you say? I mean, have you ever been in a situation? I'm not putting you on the spot, Minister Joe. I'll throw myself under the bus if you want. Have you ever been in a situation where you feel like the Lord has made a promise to you, but it's taking so long to materialize that you begin to doubt whether it was really God that talked to you, or begin to doubt the truthfulness of what you thought?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a sense of desperation sometimes when you feel like you've been waiting on something for so long. I'm not thinking of anything right actually exactly in particular, but I know what that feeling's like when you've heard parents say, this child, I know God said to me that this child has a purpose and is going to do great things, and yet you see some choices that have been made and you wonder, that
Yeah.
you get a feeling of desperation. I see it. I sense a sense of desperation in Abram, for the human side of us to say, I'm not sure when this is all really going to happen. This is painful.
I know I hate to jump into Star Wars, but I just might,
Tell
because
you that there, huh?
you have this prophecy in Star Wars, right, that Anakin is going to bring balance to the Force, but he ends up joining the dark side, which is this great, I mean, it's a pretty powerful scene, I think, but of course I get into that mythology when his mentor says to him, you were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them. You were the chosen one. Like he had this, and he eventually does bring balance to the Force, but it takes forever, and there's a very dark road before he fulfills that prophecy. That's where doubt comes in for people. We are often very certain when God makes a promise to us, but there's a distance between the promise and its fulfillment. That is the space of faith. And that is very, very hard space to live in. So Abraham has a promise, and he has changed his whole life based on this promise. He left his home. He's come to a strange land. He has had some not great experiences early on here. And God is reaffirming in chapter 15 the same promise he made in chapter 12. But now Abraham has walked with him a little while, and nothing has really happened. And so now it's becoming difficult to believe. And the longer the delay between the promise and its fulfillment, the harder it is to maintain faith. For many Christians, this is one of the great difficulties of still believing in Jesus coming back, and maybe even in his existence, because he made that promise, best estimate, mine anyway, 33 AD. And here we are in 2020, and he's still not returned. And the longer that space between promise and fulfillment, the more difficult it is to believe in the truthfulness of the promise. And that's happening to Abraham here. Yeah. It was easier to believe in chapter 12 that God was going to make him into a great nation than it is in chapter 15, because nothing has happened. Right. And I think we all can identify. I've talked with some Christians who they've never had to live in that space. Like I talk to them and I think I'm so envious of them. That God made a promise and it was fulfilled within 24 hours almost every time. They almost have never had to wait for anything. That's not been my experience. Like from promise to fulfillment for me can be so far. And the hardest time for me is near the end of that time, when it feels like I must have misheard. God never said this. This is ridiculous. Like either I'm an idiot or God's a liar, and I'm going to go with the I'm an idiot solution to this. Yeah. So I don't know if you've been in that space, but I feel very much that's where Abraham is in this story. I think he's beginning to question, because remember, he doesn't know God. Like this isn't like, we're not told that Abraham comes from a family that was faithful like Noah, and they had carried on the traditions of the people from Adam on. And known this God. We're not told any of that. He's just plucked out of Samaria, out of a pagan nation. So he doesn't even know who this God is. He follows him in faith. But now, these promises seem less likely the longer he goes. He's not getting any younger. Yeah. And he has no kids. And what's going to happen? So I feel like it's important for us to delineate that space here. That this is, I think, a critical moment for Abraham. And I think God realizes it, how critical it is.
Not only that, but I'm sure he was afraid to tell people this. I mean, think about it, about all those people that worked for him, and they're looking at him. They're like, he's got no kids. We're gonna have a job if he kicks the bucket, Or, yeah. I mean, I'm sure it was embarrassing if he were to say, I left all this stuff. I left on my homeland and came here. God told me to be here. He's going to, I don't know. How many people would you tell that my descendants are going to be like the dust around here, or like the stars?
I wonder if Abraham told anybody. If I can only read Abraham through my own personality, but if it were me, I wouldn't have told anybody. I would have just kept it to myself.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, but even in that culture, it was like whether or not his leadership would be sustainable.
Right.
Because they would be looking for the next heir. They would be looking.
And probably they all knew it was Eliezer, I would imagine. Abram makes a very important and very significant request of God. And I don't know if you noticed, Minister Joe, that it was a request. But he says, so God says, don't be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield, your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless. So he's asking for a sign, some sort of a tangible pledge that will assure Abram of God's faithfulness to this word he's given him. Abraham, I think it's funny, his faith, this is the passage where Abraham's faith is credited as righteousness. But what I'm really hammering, if you can't tell, Minister Joe, is at the beginning, his faith seems to be at a low point before it reaches its high point. And the low point, he comes to God and says, God, I need assurances. Can you give me assurances that this is going to happen? Because right now, it's not looking good.
Right.
And
this is embarrassing. I can hear him saying it. This is embarrassing.
Yeah.
I come all this way to make some altars and
you're making me look like a fool here, God.
Yeah.
Like I got all these people following me. They left Ur under the promises we were going to be this great nation. And I hate to tell you, but I don't have an heir.
Not happening yet.
And God is patient with that, right? So this is verse 4, right? The word of the Lord came to him. We don't know how long it took. This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue is the way that the NRSV translates it, because that's a little more literal. But meaning that a child from your own body. Now, it would be very helpful at this moment to the rest of the story if God told Abraham that it would also be from Sarah's body. Right? It would help them to avoid a mistake later on.
Right.
But he doesn't. He just insists it will be an actual child of Abraham. So this is the first time Abraham has been given that specific promise. Now, it might be implied in the other promises, but it's explicit here. And then, as you said, he points them to the stars. But verse 6 is that critical verse. The verse, you might say, launched the Protestant Reformation. It certainly has launched a lot of debate in the church. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So the word for believed is the Hebrew word aman, where we get the word amen from. And the word for righteousness is the word zedekah, holiness. So what it is saying, now we can deal with what Paul thought that this all meant, if you want to. But what it's saying in the Hebrew is that Abraham took God at his word. And the word and God believes that that action sets Abraham apart, makes him holy. God accounted Abram's trust in him, that he would do what he said, as something that made Abraham holy to God, righteousness. So that's what the Hebrew looks like. Now, Paul believed that that's essentially what faith does for all of us, faith in Jesus. But I want to keep it in context at first. Abram says, you've made these promises to me. Can you give me an assurance that you're going to do this the way I think you will? And God says, I will make you as numerous as the stars in the sky, and it will be from a child born from your own body. And Abram says, good enough. I just want to interrogate that a little bit. Like, what does this tell us about Abraham? What does it tell us about God? And he's still Abram right now, but I'm calling him Abraham.
There you go. Well, I think the very fact that the stars are there, he points to the stars as opposed to dust, making that transition. I think that maybe he grasped the fact, and this may be stretching, grasped the fact that the stars are the handiwork of God, or the lights in the sky. He's brought back to the idea of creation, the idea of God's awesome power. I mean, you think of dust is more like, you're breathing it. They were really familiar with dust, but
dust. It's the word afar in chapter 13. It's what humans are made of.
Yeah, humans are made of, but to see the power of God, that idea of the createdness. I mean, obviously you could argue. You could argue that. Sorry, argue a deeper conversation about pulling that back from creation. But I'm saying the power of God seems so much more revealed in the creation of in and of itself. The skies, the vastness of it. I mean, I think it would be easier to count the stars, it seems like, than to count the dust on the ground. But the reality of who you're talking to.
That's it. Yeah, that's the important thing, because Abraham asks more or less for a sign,
mm-hmm.
and God seals his promise by pointing to the stars. So he's revealing to Abraham he's the creator of the stars. And that is a claim beyond that of any God in this region of the world. There was not one God that created everything. It was always, in the stories of the ancient Near East, it's always a compendium of gods, generally fighting, and humans are incidental.
Mm-hmm.
But here he says, you want a sign? I mean, I'm paraphrasing what's beneath this text, I think.
Yeah.
But do you want a sign that I'm going to do what I look at the stars?
Mm-hmm.
And what he's revealing to Abraham is who he is. And Abraham believes it.
Mm-hmm.
He believes it. Now, there's no reason for him to believe it at this point. I mean, this God has just come to him. We don't know anything. This God hasn't done anything too exceptional. I mean, he's plagued the Egyptians. He's allowed Abraham to have victory over these enemies to rescue Lot. His flocks have certainly increased. So he has prospered. But there's nothing in those experiences to make the leap to the idea that this God created everything.
Mm-hmm.
This is when he reveals who he really is to Abraham.
Yeah.
And he's not just the God of Abraham. He's the God of everything. I mean, if he's the God who created all the stars, he's the God of everything. Oftentimes, the ancient world would have each star as a different God or something, each constellation, so whatever. But he's the God of everything, and Abraham believes him. So God, this might be one of the reasons when Jesus says you pray to God, you say, Our Father who is in the heavens, right? Points him to the cosmic picture of who God is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Abraham just believes him. Something about the way God said it, or his experiences to this point, leads him to trust. And it's enough for him. He doesn't need to see a big miracle. He doesn't need, like Moses, to put your hand in and pull it out and have it be leprous. He doesn't need to turn his staff into a snake. He doesn't need to see bread fall from the heavens. He doesn't need to see Jesus resurrected from the dead. He believes him. And the Lord reckons that trust Abraham places in him as righteousness.
Is there a sense too in your mind that God is revealing some of these creation points to reveal his power to be able to bring about this child?
Yeah, but still, he only has God's word on it.
Yeah.
Certainly, a God who could create the stars would certainly be able to create a child, but he only has God's word on it. He doesn't have any evidence at this point in the story. He has some tangential things, like this God certainly can make his animals procreate,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly provide the right nutrients and water so that they can grow. And he certainly has proven that he can bring curses on people if he has to protect Sarah. So he's demonstrated he is powerful. But again, you and I read the story back through the lens of Jesus, back through the entire history of Israel, back through the law of Moses, and we know a lot more than Abraham would have known about this God. And we often will read all that back in, but if we try and stand in the position of Abraham, this is a bold claim God is making. Very little evidence for it, other than God saying it to be true. And Abram believes him. Abram, you see all these stars? I'll make your children as numerous as those. Now, he's not even overtly saying he made the stars, but he's pointing him to the stars as proof. This is a remarkable amount of faith, is my point, that Abraham trusts God so implicitly. But he does trust him. You notice it's so different than Moses. Moses, who has much more history, he has the story of Abraham behind him. God comes to him in the burning bush and says, I want to send you as a deliverer. And Moses says, oh, no, not me. I can't do that. I'm not a good speaker. And God says, who makes people speak? Moses, well, you don't understand, Lord. I've got foreskin lips. That's what the Hebrew says. And God says, fine, I'll send somebody. You don't see that with Abraham. That's my point. This is what distinguishes Abraham in some ways.
Yeah.
He believes him. Now, he still doesn't know how he's going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But he believes him, and that sets Abraham apart. It sets him apart from everybody in all of history. You and I believe in God, but we have been witnesses to the resurrection of the dead.
Right.
We've been witness to the ministry of Jesus. We've been witness to the history of Israel. You and I believe on much more evidence than Abraham had. And yet he believed God in such a way that from this point forward, all who put this faith in God would be called children of Abraham. It's amazing. And I don't want to give him too much credit because he is clearly a flawed human being. We've already seen it. But his trust, the trust he places in God is that's the righteousness God's looking for. We often think that it's purely about obedience or purely about doing things or purely about, but what God is looking for is people who trust him, who believe he can do what he says and will do what he promises, who trust his teachings. And that is one thing Abraham does. He doesn't do everything right. He makes a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of errors in Abraham's life. He's going to make a buffoon of a mistake with Hagar later on. But he trusts this God. He trusts him. And when God tells him to do something, Abraham trusts him enough to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what God's looking for. It's not about fulfilling a list of works. It's about trusting God.
Now, the trust issue is really the root of the tree.
Right.
So that
when
if
we
you can't
go
trust
to
God,
knowledge for our life.
yeah. I mean, the whole setting apart of the stars, whole setting part of the stars, and that idea of the loftiness of that really begins to show I think reveal the character that actually Abram was asked to develop to.
Yeah.
Because that trust is like, it's a stretching thing to, I mean,
Like, I'll give you a
humanistic.
very tangible example. Like, when Jesus says, "You've heard it said, do not murder. But I tell you, do not hate your brother." Now, we might think of that as just a rule we're supposed to follow. And our natural response might be, well, that's impossible. I can't control my feelings, right? We might say something like that. Or I can't help if I hate somebody, but I can help what I do to them. We might say something like that in defense. But what faith does, what the kind of faith of Abraham does, is when Jesus says, I tell you, don't hate, we believe him.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that hating is wrong. And if we believe it's wrong, we'll stop justifying it. Now, we might still experience it, but we will stop justifying it. And this is the kind of faith that is accounted as righteousness, agreeing with God. So in the case of hate, I've met a lot of Christians who clearly don't agree with God that hate is wrong, because they refuse, they keep defending it, either by saying, well, I can't stop, or, but you don't know what that person did to me, or, but you don't understand. These are all ways of defending our disagreement with Jesus on this teaching. The kind of faith of Abraham that's reckoned as righteousness is not legalism. It's not simply obeying stuff. It's agreeing with God. And that agreement is expressed. So if I continue to feel hate for my brother, I still, if I trust Jesus, have to know that that is wrong and have to continue to war against it, because I believe him when he tells me it's wrong.
Right.
I believe him when he tells me that hating is no different in God's eyes than murdering. If I believe that, my whole orientation towards this experience I'm having is going to change. Mm-hmm. And that is the faith of Abraham, and it's going to be tested. Up to this point, it hasn't been tested too much, so it might sound like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but it's going to be tested, and it's ultimately tested, his trust in God, when God asks him to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
So this is going to have practical application, but at this point, the faith that will allow him to do what he does in chapter 22 is already present here. He already trusts God.
Mm-hmm.
And so as soon as God tells him, no, you will have a son, he believes it. Now, God had never said that before. He said he was going to have heirs, but he didn't know how it was going to happen. Now he said he has a son. Good enough. I believe you. Now, is Sarah going to be the mother? He doesn't ask that question.
Yeah. He doesn't ask how either. I mean,
no, it would have been nice if Abraham interrogated a little more. It might have saved him some problems later.
Yeah.
But he just believes him. And now God's going to make a covenant with Abraham. And I want to make sure we spend some time on this covenant. So I'm going to let you be the first taker on this. Mm. But here's the covenant he makes. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? So he's already believed God about the son, but he hasn't yet received any sign with respect to the receiving of the land. And we've already seen this land is loaded with people. That's what chapter 14 was about. And they are a bunch of different fiefdoms, different kings. They have different alliances, some more powerful than others, but this is no open prairie, for him to receive. So he says, oh Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And God said, and this is where God's making a covenant, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two. And the reason he cuts them, the word for covenant is the word brit or brit, which means to cut. And so to make a covenant, something has to be sacrificed. So he's fully aware he's got to cut these things. It's part of the culture. So he brought all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. A deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. We'll stop there for the moment. So let's start at the beginning of this covenant. So God reaffirms that he's the one who called him from Ur. It's important that God do that. We have this idea, of course, Abram always knew he was talking to God. He might not have always known. But God reaffirms the same one who called you, that's the one talking to you now. And Abram says, how do I know that this is going to be mine? Now, he's already received that promise twice. But now he wants to know how. He's asking God. This is a very patient way of asking God, can you make this agreement formal? Right now, it's been a gentleman's agreement. You've said it, and I believed you. But can we formalize it? And God does it. God says yes. What do you make of these very specific instructions?
Well, it's certainly not something familiar to this time, but the whole idea of these animals, that there wasn't an easy thing to do. And the picture I have of cutting those large animals in half, like I said, it's not an easy thing to do.
No.
And
birds of prey were coming down, and he had to chase them away.
Yeah. And the amount of blood that would have been present as well. All of that to be said, that the specific parts of that show a type of commitment that is really foreign to us, I think, but yet in some ways could show that Abram was very, very sincere about what was going to happen here. I mean, to really say it, I'm not sure that anybody really probably understands right off why God would ask him to do this, other than
he's cutting a covenant, which requires a sacrifice. And I think this is coming from the Hittites. A lot of more liberal-leaning scholars would say it's coming from Babylonian treaties. I think it's a Hittite treaty that he's enacting here. They also had covenants like this. But he knew what to do. He knew to cut the animals. But God tells him specifically 2 females, right? So we often say cows and goats and sheep. And all the Hebrew is you have big animals, small animals who are of the herd. So a female goat is fine. Could have been a sheep, though. I think in Hebrew either would have worked. A female of the larger animals, we would say cows, but I think it's a little different in the Middle East than what we have. But 2 females, 1 ram, so that's male, and then 2 of the clean birds, turtle dove and pigeon. They make a distinction because they're 2 different Hebrew words, but I'm not sure anybody really knows the difference between them specifically. So, but he's very specific.
Yeah.
He doesn't say to Abraham, bring me what you want. Go to your flocks and bring me what you want. He gives him very specific instructions. And again, Abraham follows them to the letter. Again, he's evidencing his trust. How long, I didn't do this research. I should have done this research. How long would it take a buzzard or a vulture to find a dead animal after it had been newly sacrifice. Now, you might say maybe they hung around these camps because they were butchering animals all the time. So maybe they were nearby. But I know watching animal videos, nature videos, and things like that, that in the wilderness, after a kill, an animal has, a few hours, maybe, before the scent of the kill is caught by these other creatures. Maybe an hour in a densely populated area, but there's some time between these things. And so it makes sense, right? That vultures would start descending trying to get the food.
Right.
But why include that detail?
I got a few thoughts. They might be left field, but the first ones, it's going to sound a little strange, but they're heifers. So this is going to be their first year of having a child.
Yeah, their third year, right? They're mature.
Yeah, but a heifer usually means they haven't had a baby yet.
Right.
So
but in 3 years they would be mature, right?
Yeah.
So this is killing one before it gets pregnant.
I was thinking that they may be symbolic of the women and the ram being the offspring, and then the actual birds being sacrifices that I know later on become the requirement sacrifice for consecration or but those are just some thoughts, the initial. But the birds themselves remind me of the passage you brought up one time where their carcasses there the vultures are.
I know, like the reference that Jesus makes when they say, when the disciples say, well, Jesus says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation set up in the holy place, then flee. And the disciples say something like, well, where? Like, how will we know where to go? And Jesus' response is, where the carcasses are, there the vultures will gather. And you can be tempted to read that as dead people, but it might be a reference to this passage that you've got to find the covenant of Abraham. That's where the vultures are, right? Where the carcasses that have been sacrificed are.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be an indication that Jesus was pointing them back to Abraham's covenant.
Mm-hmm.
That when they have to flee Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed, they're going to have to return to the faith of Abraham. Mm-hmm. That may be what he was saying there. I don't know that it's what he was saying, but when I preached through that passage, when I did the Mark series, I suspect that that's what Jesus was pointing, this passage. It's still the question, why did the writer of Genesis include the vultures? It's a deep question, but Jesus uses the fact that he did, I think.
Yeah. Well, the vultures are obviously those who are looking on to.
And it gives us a sense that there was some time delay, right? That God didn't come immediately upon the sacrifice.
Depending upon the amount of blood, scientifically, depending on the amount of, forensically, should we say, depending on the amount of heat and the amount of blood, how the sacrifices were prepared. Whether they slit them and hung them and then cut them in half, or he just went over and stabbed them, killed them, and then cut them in half. There was a big area of blood.
Yeah.
I tend to think that the vultures are probably attracted by the smell of the blood.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's at least been a period of time, and this catches us with a theme that I keep saying this, right? From the distance between the promise and the fulfillment is the hardest road to walk. And we see this in Abraham with the coming of his son. There's been this distance. He's going to be a great nation, but he still doesn't have a child, and we're still waiting for that to be fulfilled. And that's a difficult space to walk. And you still have, he says, how do I know I'm going to receive the land? God says, here, bring these animals to me and make a sacrifice. He makes the sacrifice, but there is a distance between his obedience and God actually doing something with it long enough that birds of prey have found the carcasses, and not just found them, not just circled, but landed and tried to take them over. And Abraham is fighting them off. That's the space right between promise and fulfillment. He's fighting off the vultures. He's fighting off the animals, waiting for God to come. You might even say that this is the space of Israel, like Saul is in this space, right? Where he is told that he's got to wait for Samuel to make a sacrifice. But as he waits, all the people are abandoning the battle, and Saul panics and makes the sacrifice early. Like, you keep seeing this space. That, I guess that's what I'm saying. The story is very much about this space. And even the promise God makes, Abraham says, how do I know I'll have it fulfilled? And God says, well, 400 years after your children have been slaves someplace else, then you'll get it. Talk about a distance.
He's like, what?
I know. Wait, come again?
I'm a little hard to hear it now. It's only been 98 years.
So what I want to say is that this distance between promise and fulfillment is all over this story, and it defines the faith of Abraham. Mm. And you and I think even today, find that space very difficult to navigate. Mm. Like, it's a wonderful moment, isn't it, when God promises you something and you own it? Like you say, oh, I'm going to do this. This is what you want me to do. Or he promises you that you'll, who knows what it is. Everybody has a different promise that they feel the Lord has made to them. I remember a woman telling me that she had received a promise that her father was going to receive Christ. And she had prayed and prayed and prayed for years and years and years and years, and it was fulfilled on his deathbed, right? But that distance in believing that you heard right, believing that God can do this and would do it, is such a difficult space to walk. And it's so interesting to me that Abraham is righteous, not because of how he responds to the promise initially or to the day he receives the fulfillment and Isaac is born, but he's considered righteous in the middle. Mm. Righteousness is about how we navigate the road between promise and fulfillment. And God prophesies that road for your children, 400 years. Mm. 400 years between promise and fulfillment.
And a whole lot of vultures.
Wow. Right?
A lot of those vultures are the doubt.
Oh, the vultures, yeah. They want to take the sacrifice away. Yeah. Right? They want to eat it all up. And Abraham's fighting it off. Yeah, you could see this like acted out. Like Abraham's fighting off doubts. He's fighting off fears. He's fighting off, in some places, God puts him in the very space that he's been living in.
Yeah. I mean,
everything is coming to steal his faith.
He told him to do that. And now he's waiting for God to show up. I mean,
right.
I did this now. What's going to happen now? And here comes the birds. What are we going to do?
Yeah, that's a great image. You could almost see this as a real life example of what also happens to us spiritually.
Yeah.
The vultures come.
Yeah, God tends to do that for me a lot. Yeah.
Like, are you thinking the birds and the seed on the path? Remember Jesus' story of the birds come and take the seed before it can root. The vultures come and take the sacrifice before the covenant can be made. Mm-hmm. Right? It's so important for us to recognize this is where faith is. This is where faith is. When the vultures are coming on the carcasses and God hasn't arrived yet. When the people are abandoning the ship in the case of Saul, but Samuel hasn't come yet to make the sacrifice that he promised. When Jesus has said he's coming back, but it's been, 980 some odd years and he still hasn't. Like, this is where faith is. And faith is walking with God when the evidence is gone.
That's what most people are saying to us as Christians. Like, oh, Jesus said he's supposed to be coming back. This is the same thing as these vultures flying over our heads. The questions are, when's this going to be fulfilled? And God all along is saying to us, see the stars, see the promises I've given you.
Do you trust me?
Yeah. Do you trust me?
Do you trust me? Do you believe that I will do what I say? Can you be faithful even if you don't live to see it?
Right.
And many of today, that kind of faith is poo-pooed as foolishness, as childishness. We need to trust based on evidence, and reason and rationality. And that's not. Abraham's faith is based on some reason. I mean, he's seen the curses that were poured out on Pharaoh. He has seen the blessing of his flocks. He's had encounters with God. It's not like it's based on nothing, but it's not based on quite enough to prove that what God says is going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's that.
But we always want more. We always want more.
Yeah, one more sign. Just like when Jesus was on earth, he feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread, and they're still asking for signs. He casts out demons. They're still asking for signs. He raises dead people. They're still asking for signs. It's never enough.
He's on the cross, hanging on the cross, and they're asking for a sign. If you're truly the Son of God, come down from the cross.
Yeah. And then he rose from the dead, and they said, yeah, sure he did. You made it up. I mean, there's never enough for anybody. But again, we are given in this promise that 400 years, this is what I want to dial in on. It's going to be 400 years, they're going to be slaves. He doesn't tell them where, but not this place, because they're going to have to come back here.
Right.
400 years are going to be slaves. Why? This is verse 16. Why 400 years? That's a long time. That's almost twice the age of our country.
Yeah.
Why are they going to be slaves 400 years? Verse 16.
Because of the sins of the Amorites is not complete.
Because God, the mercy on the Amorites hasn't been exhausted. Now, who are the Amorites? Well, this is usually the catch-all term for the peoples of Canaan, even though the Amorites are a specific group within Canaan. But we already know God's working with them. How do we know? Melchizedek, right? We know that God is at work in this land, and he is not going to give Abraham's descendants this land until the Amorites have forfeited it through their sin. So God's mercy on the Amorites is going to cost Abraham's descendants 400 years of delay and slavery. And when God finally does send the people of Israel into the land, and he gives King Saul the command to wipe out the Amalekites, this is after 4 centuries of mercy, of time. So Abraham is realizing in this promise that there's more going on than just Abraham. And he already got a picture of that with Melchizedek, but now it's confirmed in the covenant. I have some business to do with the Amorites, and I'm not going to bring your people into this land and give it to them until my work with the Amorites is completed. Now, of course, he realizes that they're on a trajectory of ever-increasing sin, right? That's where they're headed.
Yeah. Oftentimes people, this is that concept too, that people often want to say that God is some other kind of God, the God of the Old Testament, that because of the judgment on the people of the land there, but they fail to understand that God is calling to all, everyone to come to him,
and he's patiently working with more than just the people highlighted in the story. Mm-hmm. Israel is unique. They are given the law uniquely. God has never set up another nation like he has Israel. And he's never given the specifics to another people the way he gave specifics through Moses. So it's a unique people with a unique call in the world. But that's not to say that God has not been working outside of the story, that we just don't know those stories, but we have glimpses of them. Melchizedek, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. What does that mean? What are you doing with the Amorites? Pharaohs will sometimes come through the land of Israel and tell the people of Israel, your God sent me on this mission, so leave me be. What? God's talking to Pharaoh? Right. You have King Cyrus, who when he gives the edict for the Israelites to return from exile, he claims that the God of the heavens revealed to him that he's made him the king that he is and that he owes him. So he's talking with Cyrus. We have the story in Daniel of God's interactions with Nebuchadnezzar and his attempt to get him to repent. So we have these glimpses that God has been working outside of Israel, but he works uniquely through Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's their authority. But that's not to say that there aren't more stories. Mm-hmm. You know, and this is another glimpse at that. And God's mercy on the Amorites is going to cost Israel a lot. 4 centuries of slavery. Man. It's tough stuff.
It is.
So let's look at this last part. I don't have a lot to say about this, so maybe you do, Minister Joe. I'm sorry, I've been off for a week, so
yeah, you got the fire going, bro.
I got the fire going. So verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So that's the covenant that God makes with him. We should say that Israel never holds all this territory at any point in their history. They never hold all the territory from the Nile all the way to the Euphrates. So that what he gives Abram, to our knowledge, they never hold the whole of it. But that's what's been given to them. And you'll notice the Amorites are one people group listed. And somehow they're significant enough to hold off the possession of this land for 400 years.
They're the ringleaders of it seems like.
Most likely. So a few things. You notice that the theme of darkness is here, because darkness descends on Abram before God responds to him, a very deep darkness. Mm-hmm. And then he waits for darkness for this. These things that float, I used to have Hebrew students translate this. If they went on to intermediate Hebrew with me, we would translate this passage because it's really hard to translate. And so most of Genesis is fairly straightforward in translating. The Torah itself is pretty straightforward, but this is a difficult passage, indicating maybe that the language is archaic, that it's not been cleaned up. Mm. But this looks to be like a cooking pot. Like a pot that would be used for cooking food over a fire, and it's smoking. And then it's a torch or some sort of a bunch of wood that's on fire, and they pass between it. And we used to play this game. Like, do you think of them like Beauty and the Beast, like these enchanted things popping between? Or do you think that there's an invisible person holding them, walking with them? And he can't see the person, but he can see the things that are being held. We asked that question. And then I'm just throwing a lot of questions out there. I also would have them consider whether or not these specific items that are visible do they have deeper meaning? Mm. Any commentary you read on Genesis will go down that rabbit hole, and they all seem to be slightly in disagreement. Some say the smoking fire pot is a symbol of judgment in these days, and the flaming torch can be similar. So this is a very aggressive metaphor that God is allowing him to see something terrifying to him. Others say that the idea is that this is a light-bringing stuff, that it's dark, and so these lights are coming, smoke and fire. Some see an image of the fiery pillar and the pillar of smoke that leads the Israelites in the wilderness, that this is where those images come from. So there's lots of things people play with. So I don't know that you can be wrong, Minister Joe, because I'm not sure anybody knows what right is. But I mean, what is your impression of the scene here and what God is communicating through it?
Well, I can't come up with anything super out of the ordinary then.
You like that Beauty and the Beast thing, though.
Yeah, that's definitely a Chip and what's it, the
candelabra.
Butler's name. I don't know his
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, these are obviously symbols of the covenant. In the darkness, that, I think that it's kind of symbolic of the whole culture around them, what's actually happening around them. Darkness, if it was like in broad daylight, obviously you wouldn't be able to see the smoke so well and the fire so well. If there's a stark contrast between what those elements are. I don't think they just kind of skipped along there. That would be too hokey and more like Walt Disney.
Nobody
Yes.
ever films this. This is my point. Like in all the movies, you don't see this filmed because I don't think anybody knows what to do with it.
Yeah, I tend to think that it would have been like two people. When I'm thinking more Catholicism, Catholic atmosphere where they're bringing the incense down the aisle.
Yeah. This is not incense though. This is probably a pot used for cooking.
Yeah. Probably had the actual vultures in the pot. No, I'm just kidding. I think they probably have more to do with the presence of God. That's what I would probably defer to.
What I want to emphasize is that God wreathes himself in darkness in most of the time. Now we're told God is light and in him there is no darkness at all, but he often conceals his light in darkness. And you can say that the figure that's carrying these instruments is concealed from Abraham somehow. He only sees the instruments. He doesn't see God. Mm-hmm. And you can say the same thing with Moses when he sees only the back of God, and he's considered to be the only one who's ever seen God, but he only saw his back. You could say that when the Israelites come to Mount Sinai and God descends, deep darkness descends. And so he kind of is hidden in the darkness. When he comes to Job, he's hidden in a whirlwind. So this is a very similar kind of thing. And when he comes to us in Jesus, he's hidden in flesh, right? A very similar thing. Jesus tabernacles amongst us. When he lives in the Israelites, he's hidden in the Holy of Holies, like hidden within the temple. So there's a sense in which this first experience Abraham has, because this is as close as he's gotten to God, physically, ever. I mean, it's like God is there, but he can't really see him. All he can see is what God is holding. He's got this fire pot in this torch. And we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out why God is carrying that. And I think that's a worthy discussion, but I don't know that we'll solve it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the darkness. God is light, but he conceals himself in this darkness. Darkness is like a garment for God in the scriptures. And it's here in this story as well.
Yeah, I think it also gives an anticipation of delay. The 400 years is a long time. And so oftentimes people will make that comment. I just feel like I'm walking in darkness. Yeah. Like even though they have the truth, the promise that they might be righteous, there's this idea that this is going to take a long time.
Right. And that's the picture I get, why I don't spend a ton of time on what these elements mean. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, right? The one who passes between the sacrifices, Abraham can't see him, but he's bearing a torch, light, and he's carrying a cooking pot, which I take to be nourishment, food. So he's going before Abraham with the instruments of the dark. When we sing that song, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, it implies we're walking in the darkness. You don't need a lamp in the day. You need one in the dark. And so there is, I think, beautiful anticipation of what it will look like to follow this God. In the very introduction of the covenant to Abraham. And you know what it looks like, Minister Joe? following a blazing torch and a smoking pot in the dark. That's what it looks like. And that is the faith of Abraham. You have to follow the light. But we're not walking in the day here.
Right. Not an easy sell, though, is it?
No, because the new heavens and the new earth are when the light illuminates everything.
Yeah.
And there is no more night, no more darkness. And the Lamb is the light, right, of the city.
Mm-hmm.
But in this world, we walk in darkness, following the light. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
the author and perfecter. Can you imagine? This is an act of imagination, but I think it helps. That this is Jesus hidden from Abraham, but Abraham can see the torch and he can see the pot and he knows where to go. Like there's a sense of mystery in God, and yet he gives us enough to follow.
Right.
I think that's what this scene is about, rather than digging in too deeply to what the images mean.
Right. Yeah. Often it would blow your mind. It would have blown his mind if he knew exactly how God was going to do all that. It's almost amazing to me that he even told him that 400 years later. Even that is, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of information to even process.
I don't think we can overstate how important this particular story is to the whole history of salvation. Because this covenant is the covenant that the Apostle Paul insists that Jesus came to fulfill. He fulfills the law of Moses, but Moses is rooted here in Abraham. And that all of us who are Gentiles, who are not Jewish, who come to faith in Jesus, we come through the faith of Abraham. And this story defines that. And so these are my final words, and I'll let you have your final words. My final words are that the faith of Abraham exists in that very challenging space between the making of a promise and the fulfillment of that promise. That space is defined by darkness and can only be navigated by following the torch and the cooking pot that God is holding as he leads us. Like that is what I want to say. And that space can be 400 years. It can be 20 years. It can be very short, but it almost never is. And faith is exercised in that space, the space between promise and fulfillment. And it's the hardest part of the journey.
Right. And I think it'd be hard to top that if you're finished there. Other than to say that
my mother would say I'm never finished, but that's good enough.
I guess what I could say also alongside that is that often, because the days do come, so because that's the normal cycle of life. But there are those temptations, I think, that we find ourselves in. Those vultures, those questioners of that want to peck us apart or peck us to death. They're real, and sometimes those are temptations to ask us or to drive us to questions that can push us away from God. And I think people, especially in our culture, those who are aspiring more to atheist point of view or the agnostic point of view, where their questions have become those vultures that have literally torn them apart.
And it's very similar to what you were preaching on Sunday, which is in this context with the arguing of Abram and Lot's workers, sheep herders, that that it's actually their fight that drives those two men apart. Very similar. You got to fight off the vultures, don't you?
Yes, and Abram did. When God came was in that darkness to affirm what he had done was right, and it wasn't like God didn't tell him to do that, but he had the trust and realized that that there's more to it than
Yeah. And you've said it several times, and I'll just reaffirm it. We do get nagged in that space of waiting. Like there's so many doubts, aren't there? I mean, how many people do we minister with who they're homebound, they can't leave? Now it's everybody because of this COVID virus, but we've been ministering for years with people who this is their life experience. They can't leave their house. They feel like they're not contributing. They know the promises of Jesus, but they're living in this space that's very difficult to live. I mean, this is where faith exercises. And you and I both know sometimes you walk into that space and there's such faith in that person that you leave energized. Like I have left talking with people living in that space of chronic pain, of isolation, of waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises to make them whole and healthy and risen from the dead, and having it not arrive, in fact, having the exact opposite experience. And some of them are so full of faith, and that I will leave feeling that I'm the one who was visited. And then there are other situations where you can tell the vultures have done their work. Despair has settled, and it's a dark and terrible place. And all I can do is ask God to have mercy and bring some light, you know. But we have to recognize that this is the space of faith. There's always a distance between promise and fulfillment, and that's when the vultures descend.
Yeah. I saw a movie recently. Now it's called Full Count, about a baseball player. And not at all what I thought it would be about. But there was a guy who comes into the movie, and I know this is not key in this program, so it's probably not real helpful, but he looked at the one kid and he said to him, the difference between you and me is that I have hope. And that's kind of stuck with me a little bit. Thinking about everyone, including Eleazar, could have looked at Abraham and said, "You're crazy, man. You're crazy. This is not going to work the way you think it's
like
going."
Just like Noah.
You're crazy.
Why are you building this boat?
Yeah.
But that's how we operate as Christians. We operate in faith, meaning that we follow what may look foolish to the world, but we follow in this hope that you're talking about, believing that God will fulfill his promises, that this is the right way to live, even when the world tells us that we're crazy, you know. And that's what it means to really have faith in God, not to do crazy for crazy's sake, but to do what God asks because we trust him.
And they call that righteousness.
And God credits that trust righteousness.
Yep.
And Abraham makes all kinds of mistakes. So it's not about sinless perfection, but it's about trust.
Right.
You know how many of us have done the absolute wrong thing believing it was what God wanted? That's honorable. Of course, you should learn from it. It's not honorable to do it again. Right? But we can, you know, I don't quote John Maxwell very much, not because I don't know him personally, but I've not found much in his books that I want to quote. But this one phrase that he seems to have coined, at least it's the only place I've read it, continues to bear fruit for me. And it's that when we do fall, we have to fall forward. You know, we have to fall in faith. Not meaning that what Luther said, when you sin boldly, more boldly still believe. That I wish I could excise from the knowledge of the world.
You're not the only one.
But sometimes we do make mistakes. Sometimes we do step out in faith only to find out that we've been deceived, that it wasn't God who put us out on that ledge. It was something else. Sometimes that happens, but it's the trust that he judges us by, not the execution or the smarts or the intelligence or the foresight, but the trust.
Yeah, or even the results.
And that should be great hope to the people. He asks nothing of you but your trust. But your trust is going to have feet, you know, and we trust that he will forgive us when we end up failing, but not because we aim to fail. That's a whole different level of interaction with God. You know, I remember a comedian, I can't remember which one, said that he received a gift and he didn't appreciate it. And the person who gave it to him said, well, it's the thought that counts. And he said, well, now I'm really upset.
Wow.
I thought that's good. But you couldn't even afford to mean well. Some people don't even bother to mean well. Like we're so sure Jesus will forgive us, we don't even bother to aim at the target. Sin is missing the mark. What is it when you don't even aim? What is that? That falls short even of sin.
Painful.
Yeah, that's just being lazy.
Yeah.
So we will miss the mark, but what God asks is that we aim right.
Yeah. You'll never hit it if you don't aim.
Right. And even when you do aim, you'll miss it sometimes, but it's the faith, it's the trust. And that's the righteousness of Abraham. And that's the righteousness of the people of God. Mm-hmm. It's never separate from works, but it doesn't mean we always get it right. And that Abraham's going to get a lot wrong. But we've been told that his sight is set on the right thing. It doesn't mean his heart was right. Those ridiculous, superficial things we say. Well, his heart was in the right place. It's not that. He's trusting God. He just can't tell where God is leading. He sees the light out there.
Yeah, it's not that easy, guys.
It's not easy to determine what God wants you to do.
It's not that easy.
That's the point, right? It's not easy to determine what he wants you to do.
Yeah, and there's got to be some work, some struggle, some ownership.
Maybe intentionally.
Yeah, of course.
And so we are going to make mistakes because he doesn't make it easy for us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as though God comes and dictates specifics. He might say to you, don't, marry someone who's of the faith, as Paul says, right? Well, that's pretty vague. There are a lot of people who meet that criteria. Which one should I marry? Well, sometimes he leaves. I've heard stories of some people who've been given specific direction, but for most people, they got to figure it out, and so it's not always easy to determine what God wants you to do, and it's not supposed to be easy.
In the case of marriage, you better figure it out.
Yeah. But my point is it's not supposed to be easy. But it's who we're following that matters. And what the law gives you and what Jesus' teachings gives us are ways to evaluate who we're listening to. So it's not all that God expects us is not all written in the law. Everything written in the law he expects, but not everything he expects is written in the law. But the law gives you kind of a way to gauge what road you're on. So if you hate a lot of people, that tells you who you're listening to,
yep.
Right? And if you lust after everybody you see, well, that tells you who you're listening to.
Mm-hmm.
And if you never give to anyone in need unless God hits you over the head with a frying pan and tells you have no other choice, then you know who you're listening to. Like the law kind of like marks the boundaries so that you can see if you're even in the ball field,
mm-hmm.
But it doesn't tell you everything. I mean, God, you still have to negotiate. You still have to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Love your enemies. What does that mean? What does that look like when I'm in war? What does it look like when I'm entrenched in a dispute with an unfaithful spouse? What does it mean if I'm in an abusive situation? What does it mean if I'm dealing with one of my children who's a drug addict? What does it mean when I'm dealing with a president or a government that maybe is not doing what I want, what I think is right to be done? What does it mean to love my neighbor as myself? What does it mean to pray for my enemies? Like knowing that that's what God expects is not the same as knowing exactly what to do.
Yeah.
And that is why I think it's always darkness.
Mm-hmm.
But there is light. You must follow the light bringer. And Abraham was doing that, however imperfectly, and we will too. Well, I hope that's helpful for somebody.
Me too.
Any final words, Minister Joe, as we say goodbye to the folks for this one?
Yeah, well, I think what we've been saying is that I think Paul said it pretty clearly. He says, work out your faith with fear and trembling. I think what he's talking about.
I think he said, work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
Yeah. So the idea is that here we see a real physical image of trusting God, even in the darkness, and maybe when you don't really understand what in the world's going on.
Yeah.
So don't give up so easily is what I would encourage you to say, even if it's difficult.
And I'll say a good word here. Like, one of the reasons that I reached out to you, Minister Joe, to ask you to join this team, one of the reasons is because I had seen in our previous engagements that you were a person who had learned how to follow God in the dark, when things were not clear, when it was not easy to determine what was right and wrong. I had watched you struggle to determine God's will in those seasons. And that, to me, the most important character, in my view, of a minister is someone who keeps his eyes on God, or her eyes on God, in the dark, when it's hard to see the way. And I value that in you. I know you probably feel that you're not perfect at it, but I don't really trust a person who hasn't had to follow God through the dark. When someone tells me, I've always known God's will, I've never had to worry about it, I think that's great. I celebrate it, but I'm not sure I want to be in the trenches with you. You know what I mean? Because I think, ministry is dark a lot of the time. If you've never experienced it, it's going to eat you up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes all you have is this little flicker of light of Jesus. You can see him on the path ahead of you, holding that pot and holding that torch, and you can see it. You can't see anything else, and you don't know what is in the way between you and that light, but you know that's the right way to go.
Yeah, well, follow that light, otherwise you're tripping on the carcass.
That's right. Yeah, who knows what's between you and that light, but get to that light.
Follow that light. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I appreciate your kind words there. I'll take it as a compliment.
I mean it as a compliment. I hope it came across that way.
Because I do trust God. I have no other desire.
And you and I both know how hard it is to determine his will, even when you love him with all your heart. And it's a wrestling match. And it takes prayer, it takes conversation with people, it takes the word, and it takes faith. But he gives us enough.
He does.
Yeah. Manna in every wilderness.
Yep.
But only enough for today.
Yeah. You don't want to eat tomorrow's on that.
No. Yeah. You
Learn
read the story yourselves.
Yeah.
What happens. So, well, thank you everybody for joining us. We hope that this was helpful to those who have hung in with us. I know these are deep conversations, but I hope you see just how practical they are. And if you do find yourself in that difficult space between a promise you believe God made to you and the fulfillment of that promise being so delayed that you've begun to despair, it's always appropriate to ask whether it was really God who made that promise to you, because lots of false promises are made by false prophets and false voices and false spirits. But if it really was God, this is the place in which your faith is tested, and take courage from the example of Abraham. Even though it was 400 years in coming, the Israelites did conquer Canaan.